Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Well, I guess it's still good morning for folks on the West Coast. Again, this is Russ Connie with Club Benchmarking. I appreciate everybody joining us today. We've got a pretty full house, which is great. Um, First, I do want to apologize if my voice sounds a little bit odd today. I did pick up a pretty bad cold at the end of CMA conference last week, so I may have to pause a few times and take a drink of water along the way, but that's just how life goes. In fact, I appreciate a lot of the names I see are folks that I got to see last week at conference, whether it was throughout the week or during the large education session we had. So it was great to see the folks that we saw last week, and for the folks that weren't able to attend or we didn't see, I appreciate you joining us today. Today we're going to talk about a specific area of key performance indicators, payroll and labor ratios. Just to start a little bit, we're going to try to hold this to about, as we build these fast fact webinars, to about 30 minutes, maybe 35 or 40 with questions, depending on how many questions we have. The intent of these webinars is to be a pretty quick hit on that usually carries a lot of data. We're going to do a little bit of a deep dive into one particular area, labor. That's one of the key performance indicators we talk about a lot. I'm going to show that indicator to you in relation to a lot of the others we look at. But we're going to peel the onion specifically on payroll and labor ratios, and I think it'll become obvious in a few minutes why we're doing that. Right now I've got everyone set to mute, but if you have questions along the way, you can either enter those questions into the GoToMeeting chat pane, or I believe you're able to unmute yourself and you can ask questions through audio as well. So happy to take any questions we can get, and we'll move right ahead. As with all the Fast Fact webinars, this will be archived and available for viewing later on our website, clubbenchmarking.com/videos. And those great. There's quite a library up there now of past webinars we've done. Those are great just for viewing yourself as a GM or a controller, or certainly they're excellent for passing on to board members and really helping them understand and interpret the data. We've got as always lately, we've got a nice combination of members and non-CB subscribers on the session today. For those of you that are already Club Benchmarking subscribers, all the data we're looking at today, all the charts, all the numbers, all the ratios, those are things that, of course, anytime you can go on and run your own reports, set your filters that you want to look at, and run these different labor and key performance indicator reports. That's the whole idea, is to give you access to that, whenever you need it to answer questions or for budgeting purposes or staff management, things like that. So for today, the goal of today is really to talk specifically about the overall payroll ratio and why it matters. Why do we spend so much time talking about this? We'll look at that. We're going to peel the onion and go below the surface down to the departmental level. And then what we're going to do really is we're going to look at clubs that have an unusually high, we'll say the upper quartile, high labor ratio. And we're going to look at clubs that have a lower than typical payroll ratio. And then down at the department level, we're going to look to see, well, what is that, how do those measures really differ? If a club allocates less to labor or more to labor, what does that mean to the departmental ratios? And can we even correlate that perhaps to member satisfaction or culture of the club? Ultimately, all this does reinforce the need for standard sets of KPIs in the industry. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But ultimately, labor is obviously critical to understand and discuss. In my view, the way I think about labor in the club industry, it's more than half of the expense of a club, and it really is the intersection of finances, culture, and member expectations. All those things come together in labor, and that's why we're going to spend a solid half hour, 30 or 40 minutes talking about it today. I always like to start with a little bit of framing of the industry, and this is a large industry. It's a $20 billion industry. We know it's very fragmented. There's 5,000 players across that $20 billion industry, and we know that the challenge of the industry, to a large extent, is the governance model of the industry, and the fact that if you just look at CMAA clubs, of which there are about 3,000, and about 11 board members per club. That's 33,000 people that are walking around today that have governance responsibility for clubs. And to make it even worse, every year, a third of those people turn over. So every 3 years, there's a brand new 33,000 people. And it's really the job of the controllers in the industry and the GMs in the industry to try to keep those people as educated as possible, such that the boards are actually have a positive impact on the club, and not only a neutral or, unfortunately, all too often a negative impact on the club. So that's why we end up talking a lot about indicators. One is strictly business management, but the other is to really convey to the folks that have governance responsibility what are the things that really matter. So with that, we're going to move on. You know, I don't know who this person is, and I feel bad because he's always my poster child for things that are wrong, and I just kind of keep adding to this list. You know, when we're talking specifically about labor, we hear things like a lot. You know, I'm sure you've all heard this in your clubs a lot. You know, we spend too much on labor. You know, what the heck do all these people do? You know, we pay our people too much. And these are all these kind of anecdotal, opinion-based statements that really don't have any basis in fact. And so everything we do in club benchmarking is towards the goal of replacing opinion with fact, educating people on what the business of a private club really is, and what are the factors that impact it, and how do you measure those things, such that when you're queuing up a decision, A, is it really you know, a critical aspect for the club right now at all, and B, if it is, you know, where are we, and do we want to move left or right, and how will we, you know, how will we impact that change? For the folks that were at conference last week, you know that we've just started talking about this, and I think it's going to be critically important. We're on a new mission right now. We've been on several missions in the industry, and our current mission is literally to create a common dashboard, a common set of KPIs and metrics that create a common language for the industry, such that people can literally talk to each other about their own clubs, and just by talking about a few different ratios or metrics or KPIs, understand where their clubs are in position to each other. Not good or bad, but size, you know, cash generation, capital, those kind of things. The club industry has a weakness inherent in it, which is there's no common framed language of which to discuss it. You can have two board members, two GMs bump into each other, and they'll ask each other how their clubs are doing. And when you listen to the conversation, it's all anecdotal. There's no fact or data around, oh, you know, our gross, you know, we're doing, you know, we're dropping members, so our gross margin has dropped from 50% to, you know, 45%. Those are the kind of discussions in any other industry. If board members or CEOs bumped into each other, they would have that kind of conversation, and each one would know exactly what they're talking about. In this industry, that doesn't exist. And so what we've done recently, we talked about at the CMA session, was we've got this KPI dashboard report now. It's in Club Benchmarking for those that want to run it as subscribers. But the goal is to literally come up with the 14 or 15 KPIs that, if these metrics are held in good stewardship, are going to directly correlate to the sustainability of that club's business model. So it's critically important. Now, what we're doing in this particular session is we're simply deep diving into one of them, the payroll ratio, and we're going to go down to the departmental level. But within this overall KPI dashboard, there's a set of operational finance KPIs, capital generation, some other operational KPIs, some membership-related KPIs, and then debt-related KPIs. And we really feel, now that we've had, you know, 5 years and thousands of clubs to look at, we're highly confident that when clubs use this as a dashboard, whether it's, you know, for their own staff management or certainly at the board level, everybody in the industry should understand these KPIs for their club and know where to go to find out, you know, where they stand relative to the industry in their particular club. So we're going to deep dive a little bit now into the payroll ratio, because that is certainly one of the KPIs, and you know, the question is, why is the overall payroll ratio such an important number? Well, we know that clubs at the median of the industry, 55% of a club's revenue goes towards payroll. So that's more than half. So it's clearly, labor is clearly the largest single expense in a club, and it also directly connects with things like I talked about, member satisfaction and member expectations and the culture of the club. And so it's critically important. Now, it also turns out that, not surprisingly, that there's a direct correlation to the overall payroll ratio and to the net operating result of the club. So if you look at the overall industry, the median club has a 55% payroll ratio, meaning its total loaded payroll spend equates to 55% of its operating revenue. So half the clubs have a ratio greater than 55%, half the clubs have less than 55%. But we can see it's pretty tight. I mean, the middle of the industry, 50% of the clubs run from 51% to 59%. And what you see if you look at these bottom numbers, there's a very direct correlation to the net operating result of the club. So for clubs that are in the upper quartile, meaning they have a higher than typical labor ratio, we can see the median club burns cash operationally. It does not support itself operationally. In fact, we see very, very consistently, if you're up in this 59 or 60, certainly above 60% labor ratio, it's very, very hard. I won't say impossible, but it's coming close to impossible to break even operationally. There are a few clubs that are able to pull it off, but very, very challenging to break even operationally if your payroll ratio is up in this upper quartile. On the flip side of that, if your payroll ratio is down in this lower quartile, you can see those clubs in general produce operating surplus to the tune of median of about $250,000 a year. And of course, clubs in the middle are in various stages of, hovering around break even, with the median club generating about $75,000 of operating surplus. So, it doesn't mean in and of itself the payroll ratio is where you are is good or bad, but in correlation, that ratio with the net operating result of the club, you can certainly draw some relationships. I mean, if you're up here and you're hemorrhaging cash operationally, the reality is you probably need to move yourself down the curve. Now, if you're down at this lower end, which, by the way, this is where the for-profit clubs tend to sit. Everything else in their business model is pretty darn consistent with the not-for-profit clubs. The reality is they just run at a lower payroll ratio. So their venue might be closed down a little bit more. They may not stay open and have staff in place, on a lousy night just in case a member shows up. And it does get to that member expectation thing a little bit. So, if you're a not-for-profit club and you're down here, you do have to be careful. Are we running really efficiently, or are we're perhaps threatening our member satisfaction a little bit? And then, by the way, if we look at clubs without golf, it's pretty similar. A few percentage points difference, but generally in the same general ballpark in terms of payroll ratio. And I should have brought these up earlier. So as we talked about, clubs down here have a far greater chance of running a surplus, and clubs on the right side have a far greater chance of running a deficit. By the way, it doesn't just correlate to high-quality clubs. Being a high-quality club doesn't mean you have a higher labor ratio. We have data from an awful lot of the distinguished and platinum clubs, and so we ran the data just for those clubs. And at the median, their labor ratio is a couple points higher, 55%, 57% versus 55%. But it's not drastically different. So, to me, that tells a story that, having a platinum level club isn't necessarily just about throwing bodies at members, but it probably has a lot to do with the attitude and the culture and the way those members actually, the way that those staff interact with the members. So we'll go through that. So what we're going to do as we pour through some more of these charts and data is we're going to run a comparison of the clubs that are in the lower quartile, where their payroll ratio is below 51%, and the upper quartile, or those clubs that have a ratio greater than 59%. We're not gonna look at clubs in the middle because that just kind of gets to shades of gray. So we're going to look on the left and right side of that overall payroll ratio curve and look at the differences down in the department levels as to the labor ratios and maybe even some member experience KPIs we can look at to understand how those clubs look different from each other. Now, what's very interesting is when you look at these two types of clubs, less than 51%, greater than 59% labor ratio, you might have thought, okay, that difference is going to show up in a particular department, right? They're going to dump way more money into food and beverage or whatever department you might think. But what's interesting is you don't really find that being the case. What you find is the clubs that spend, from percentage-wise, markedly less than the clubs that spend markedly more, their split amongst the departments is almost exactly the same. They're spending, of their labor spend, 37% F&B, 37%, 18% to course maintenance, 20%, 12% to golf ops, 10% to golf ops, 14, to G&A, 14 to G&A. So you can almost overlay those two pies on top of each other. So the conclusion you come to in that case is they're just spending a little more in labor everywhere. It's not that they're spending more in a particular area. They just spend a little bit more everywhere. So I thought that was actually pretty interesting. If you look at the split, you peel back a little bit and you just look at the split between, what goes to salary and wages and what goes to payroll, taxes, and benefits. The overall industry, 83% goes to salary and wages and 17% goes to payroll, taxes, and benefits. And you don't really see a market difference for the clubs that spend lower versus higher. It's pretty much the same. By the way, I did look on, we do have some clubs that are union-only clubs. And while they tend to be city clubs, not necessarily clubs with golf, I wanted to look at that. And what you find is the overall labor ratio is not much different. At the median, it's instead of 55%, I think it was 57%. But what you find is this is where the difference between a union and non-union club shows up. Instead of your split between salary and wages and payroll, taxes, and benefits being, say, 80-20, on a union club, it's more like 68% goes to salary and wages and 32% goes to payroll, taxes, and benefits. And it's really the benefits that makes up the difference. So it's not the overall spend that's different in a union club. It's really the split between salary and wages and PT and B, which makes sense since union scenarios typically have a much higher benefits component. This table is just kind of a summary table looking at some of the different items, trying to look at some correlations between those clubs that have a labor ratio below 51% and those that have a labor ratio above 59%. So we already know that the net operating result of the clubs is significantly different. Interestingly, if you look at the initiation fee of the one set of clubs versus the other, you see a very large difference, a median of $10,000 versus $47,000. And I think that does speak to the expectation of that membership. These clubs that have these higher labor ratios have a higher initiation fee, and higher initiation fee typically correlates to a higher member expectation. The median dues is a little bit different, but not drastically. The subsidy towards F&B, again, not surprisingly, is higher on the greater than 59% ratio clubs, and I think that's because their food and beverage, labor is also higher, and that requires more of a subsidy. I did find this next one very interesting. I took a look at clubhouse size, and what you find is for these lower ratio clubs, the median clubhouse size is 30,000 square feet. For the higher ratio clubs, the median clubhouse size is 50,000 square feet. And I guess that kind of makes sense when you think about it, because that higher member expectation, if it's a bigger clubhouse, it's going to take more bodies to just sort of staff that extra 20,000 square feet. I mean, that's a big difference. A $20,000 delta on top of 30,000, right? These clubhouses are 2/3 larger, 66% larger than these clubhouses, and that requires staff. So I think there's a very high correlation here. I'm going to do a little more research over time, but a correlation between, frankly, the size of your clubhouse and the labor ratio required to support that clubhouse. The clubs back in the heyday where they overbuilt their clubhouse, it can become a little bit of an albatross just because you have to staff it, and it becomes a lot to take care of. So I thought that was very interesting. Now as we go down into the department level a little bit, if we look at F&B labor, we know that the median labor ratio for the industry is 64%. Half the clubs have an F&B labor ratio less than that, and half the clubs have higher than that. Just like the overall labor ratio correlates to the overall operating bottom line of the club, same exact thing for F&B, right? The overall F&B result, net result out of your F&B department, correlates directly to the labor ratio. Labor is the highest component spend in your F&B operation. So, if you look at it, F&B result departmentally as a percentage of F&B revenue, we know that the median club has a loss of 8% of its sales in F&B and 4% at the city club level. If we look at the now the one side of the curve versus the other, so if I take the clubs that are below 64% and the clubs that are above 64% and look at them that way, we actually find that the club that has a labor ratio below 64%, the median club actually breaks even on food and beverage. So, which is not surprising because we know labor is the biggest component. So if you trim down labor, you get closer and closer to break even on food and beverage. Again, you have to correlate that with what's your goal, and really it's an amenity, not a profit center. So your goal really is member satisfaction. And if you look at the labor hours per cover, it's basically 1.1 labor hours per cover and $21 per cover. If you look at the clubs that have a labor ratio greater than 64%, the median club has a 20% loss as a percentage of sales. Again, not necessarily bad. If the club can afford to do that, it's fine. And their labor hours and dollars per cover are 1 1/3 hours per cover and $28 per cover. So you literally can start to see, okay, what's the difference between a club that lives, above 64% or below 64%? And again, you can correlate to, okay, I get it. There's a little bit more staff per cover, a little bit more spending per cover, and again, that's kind of those connections between the member satisfaction and finances. If we go into course maintenance a little bit, and again, we look at those clubs that spend less than 51% overall on labor and more than 59% overall on labor, we see that in course maintenance, it's a 60-40 split. 60% goes to labor, 40% goes to non-labor. And it generally, overall, we tend to see numbers very, very close to that. When you do take those upper quartile clubs, greater than 59%, they're throwing bodies at the course too. Like I said, it's not just one department they're throwing bodies at. They're throwing, a few more people everywhere. And so even in the case of course maintenance, they're spending 66% on course maintenance labor versus 60% for the lower, the lower ratio clubs. I know I'm throwing this webinar is maybe not like some of the others. I'm throwing a whole lot of numbers at folks. I'm just trying to convey some of the relationships between the difference between a club on one side of the ratio curve and the other side of the ratio curve. One of the ways that you can measure your course maintenance labor is full-time equivalent employees per hole, and for the overall industry, basically there's 0.9 full-time equivalents per golf hole, whether it's 18 or 36 holes, whatever it is. It's almost it's 9/10 of a person, if you will, per hole. When you look on either side of the curve, I know these are a little bit hard to see, but for clubs that generally spend less on labor, less of their money going towards labor, it's about 3/4 of a person per golf hole. And the clubs that's spending a little bit more, it's just under a person per golf hole. And so it turns out to $40,000 per FTE in this case and $43,000 per FTE in this case. So not only are they throwing a few more people on a per hole basis, but they're also paying a little bit more. I mean, what is that? That's about 8%. They're paying about 8% more per FTE as well. So again, just an overall little bit higher dollar spend. And if you're in that zone, I mean, you kind of start to understand what that means if you're in this side of the curve versus this side of the curve. If we go down into golf operations, one of the places, one of the ratios we look at is golf operations and golf shop labor as a percentage of basically the overall golf operations revenue. The industry runs at about 50%, specifically 48%. So if you take the total golf operations revenue, including the shop, 48% of that goes towards labor. And you can see there's a pretty wide disparity here, and it's not surprising. Some clubs that are golf only and very tied specifically to how they treat their members, around the golf operations, they're going to tend to be up in this upper quartile. And clubs that are a little bit more diverse, maybe have lots of things, lots of amenities for members to do, they can't afford to throw so much just at golf. They're the ones that tend to maybe look down at these lower ratios. But that's where the overall industry is. If we now, again, look at, okay, the clubs that have an overall ratio of 51% and below versus 59% and above, we took several different ratios to look at. Interestingly, it has nothing to do with the size of the golf operation. In fact, the median golf operations revenue for a club in the lower quartile of labor is $817,000. For clubs that have more golf operations, a higher payroll ratio, it's $760,000. So it's interesting. I found that actually is a higher revenue for clubs. I don't know that that's a direct correlation, but I didn't expect that. Labor cost per round, $14 versus $23 per round. Interesting, I thought. Golf operations net. This is where I think there is a direct impact. So these clubs that spend 51% or less on labor, they're actually netting out of their golf operations about $200,000 at the median, where these clubs that are throwing more labor at it are netting only about $60,000, so getting down closer to that break even. So they're really viewing it not so much as a place to generate cash, but as an amenity that just needs to be serviced very highly. I think these clubs that tend to look like that, they're not looking for golf ops to throw off profit. They tend to be the clubs, I think it really is all about dues for them. So they're not as concerned about generating hard cash out of their golf operations. But it's pretty interesting. For the clubs on the lower ratio curve, their median golf operations and golf shop labor to revenue is 37% versus 63%. So that's a very big difference. I know these numbers are hard to read. I apologize for that. And I think Terry Finan usually makes these slides available for folks after the webinar if they want them. Let me just check time here. Okay, I want to start moving along. So we're actually almost through. And then finally, I looked at G&A. So for the overall industry, G&A expense as a percentage of operating revenue is about 8%, and it's pretty close. It doesn't really vary widely. G&A isn't one of those things that, no club really chooses to throw lots of extra bodies at G&A. You throw bodies at things that service the amenities of the members. So you tend to throw bodies at food and beverage. You might throw bodies at the course. You might throw bodies at golf operations. But, G&A doesn't seem to vary a whole lot. So even for the clubs that are on the lower end of the overall payroll ratio, basically 7% of their operating revenue goes to G&A labor. For the clubs on the other end of the spectrum, it's only 9% of operating revenue goes towards G&A. So, not a huge disparity there. And, not surprisingly, frankly, that's not where, clubs should be looking to spend their members' money. So if we look at just a little bit of a summary table, I'm not going to go through all this now. You can watch the archive of this and take a look, or again, we can send the slides around. But, it just kind of shows that for these clubs that are on the lower overall payroll ratio spectrum versus the higher payroll ratio, it just shows up a little bit everywhere. Every one of the ratios is a little bit lower, and for the other side, every one of the ratios is a little bit higher at the departmental level. So it just reinforces that it's it's kind of a club level decision of how much we're going to throw at members in terms of staff. But don't forget that overall payroll ratio is the direct connection to the operating result of the club. So you really can't make the decision solely at the departmental level. I think first the top level decision is what should our labor ratio be and what's an affordable amount that's sustainable for the club. And then beneath that, you kind of look at and say, okay, what do the individual departmental ratios and numbers look like? So quickly in summary, then we'll go to questions. Labor really is the intersection of finances, culture, and expectations. It's, that relationship between the staff and the members, I personally believe, is where where member satisfaction comes from. So I think it's, that's why we talk about labor as much as we do. It is the largest expense of a club, and it directly connects to the results. What's critical as a reminder, the labor ratio by itself is not good or bad. The bottom line is, can you afford the labor ratio that you have, and are you meeting member expectations? That's where all this stuff comes together. You can spend a whole bunch of money and still not meet member expectations because your staff doesn't have the right relationship with the membership. On the flip side, you can have a pretty narrow or pretty thin labor ratio, but if your staff, really understands what it means to be, to have a relationship, or the right kind of relationship with a member, you can have a much lower than you would think labor ratio, and as a result probably throw off some operational surplus. Bottom line is, use these kind of core ratios to inform the underlying decisions and details. Don't make decisions in the dark. Don't let boards just say, hey, we spend too much, too little. Why is everybody standing around? Use the charts. If you're a CB member, run the golf operations report so you can look and see what's our labor per round, what's our full-time equivalent employee count, per full member equivalent. There's a whole bunch of different ratios in there that can be used to say, hey, here's where we stand. And you know what? It's not the message that you think it is. So I want to pause for a second and see if there are any questions before we just make a final closing statement. I don't know, Terry, I don't know if there were any chat questions that had come in, or any questions that came in.
You have just one question, which is, are gratuities and lessons included as salary?
They are. So gratuities, yeah, what we do, gratuities gets a little bit weird. What we do with gratuities is we treat them as, we treat gratuities as revenue, and then whatever was distributed to the employees, we treat as labor expense. So basically, when we collect in F&B, when we collect the labor expense, I think we actually specifically call out, we say use W-2 labor. So whatever was reflected in the W-2 gets treated as expense. So if it was distributed, it gets treated as labor expense. Lessons, let me think about that for a second. Lessons are treated as they are. Again, it's the same thing. We treat the lesson revenue as revenue, and we treat the payout to the person, to the employee, as a labor expense. And obviously, quite often clubs keep some level of delta. So it adds to the revenue, but it adds to the labor. So it still sort of maintains that whole ratio. Were there any other questions? Okay. Well, I think that was it. I appreciate everybody joining us today. Keep an eye out for further webinars that we'll have. There should be another one in another 4 or 6 weeks or so. And we'll probably talk a lot more about the KPI dashboard coming up. So I appreciate it, and everyone have a great day.